Another metaphor that we can use to talk about baptism is washing. If we think about it in terms of cleansing, well, you know what? This isn't maybe the best setting for us to talk about that. Let's try somewhere else.
All right, let's get back to the first commandment. You shall have no other gods. Now, obviously, this is talking, of course, about making idols and bowing down to them or whatever, but most of us have not made a wooden idol in our bedroom and we're bowing down to this wooden idol or something. Most of us don't live in Haiti or in New Guinea somewhere or something like that and have idols that we've created, a bronze snake that we put on a pole and bow down to it or whatever. So that doesn't really, we say, well, this commandment doesn't apply to us. Well, it does apply to us. And I want you to think about for a moment, and maybe even pause the video to think about this. What are the false gods in our society?
Today is Sunday, the Lord's Day, and yet at this very moment, millions of Americans are not in the Lord's house. They're in their own house, worshiping a false idol, professional football. Oh, Lord!
It's a beautiful Sunday. Perfect football weather for this incredible game. And by the way, this game is being brought to you by the good people at Duff Beer. You can't get enough of that wonderful Duff. Now, they're lining up for this crucial kick. One final tick of the clock remains. If they win, it will cap an amazing comeback. But it's a 49-yard field goal into the wind.
Make it, make it, make it, make
The
it.
kick is up.
Oh, please, please,
It's
please,
got the
please, please,
distance.
please, 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 please.
Holy Toledo, it's good!
It's good! It's good! It's good! It's good to see you all in church.
Please be seated, Homer.
Yeah, sit down, Homer.
What are the things that we are tempted to put in place of God, to worship in place of God, to maybe value so much that we value them more than even God himself? Pause the video. Let's think about that for a moment. Well, welcome back. Hope you had a good time thinking about that. Question, why does God tell us that we should have no other gods? Is he like stuck on himself or something? Well, that's absolutely not the case. God tells us that because he loves us, because he wants what's best for us in life. Think about what happens when we have another God, when something else in life is more important than God himself, when something else takes on a higher value and higher priority than even God does in our lives. For instance, what about money? Money is an incredibly important thing in our lives. I'm sure glad I have it and always kind of wish I had a little more. But what happens when money leaves its rightful place in our lives and becomes a god? When it becomes too important for us? What happens is we start to covet. We start to want what other people have. We start to want things too much. We start to be dissatisfied. We become discontent with our lives. We're always wanting more. It even can lead to stealing. And even murder of others, as others may have things that we want, and we want them so bad that we decide to kill them so we can get them. That happened throughout the scriptures, and it even happens today. And so money is wonderful. God gave it to us as a gift, but when it gets out of its rightful place, it becomes a terrible thing. What about love? Love is wonderful. God is love. But if love becomes a god, if love becomes more important than even God himself, then that leads to some pretty bad decisions. Can even lead to anger and death. Why don't you maybe talk about with your parents some examples of this, where people have loved other people or said they loved them so much, or loved other things so much that it even led to anger and death. Or what about acceptance?
Don't talk to anyone. Don't look at anyone. Don't sit down.
So not happening.
When you're accepted by your friends, when they like you, it is a wonderful thing. But when your being accepted by friends becomes more important than God himself, well, that can lead to terrible things. Because, well, you figure it out. I want you to think about that. What happens when we value acceptance by friends more than we value God himself? How does that mess up our lives? The commandment that we're going to consider today is what Lutherans number as the second commandment. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. This commandment seems especially important to God. Listen to what God says in Exodus chapter 20. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now, it's interesting that of all the commandments, this is the one where God says the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. That means that this commandment is pretty serious. Many of the other commandments don't have this after it. So what does this commandment mean? If this commandment was only about saying, oh my bleep, it's hot outside, I mean, that's bad. It's against this commandment for sure. We'll talk about that later. But is that as bad as murdering someone? Is that as bad as stealing from someone, holding someone up at gunpoint, other kinds of vicious crimes? To say, oh my bleep, it's hot outside? I think that God has something a little bit more serious in mind, although that itself is serious, which we'll get to. Now, I want to investigate then, what is God saying in this commandment? You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Here's what this commandment is really talking about at its core. This commandment, first and foremost, talks about committing evil in God's name. That is, doing evil and the claiming that God is behind it, that God is for it, that you are doing evil because God desires it. That's absolutely satanic because Satan is the author of evil. And so to do something evil and then claim that God is behind it, that is a terrible thing. Now, what are some examples that you see around our world, throughout history perhaps, or even today, of Christians, or maybe other religions around the world, people of other faiths, using God's name and then doing evil in God's name? That is clearly misusing the name of the Lord your God. So what are some examples that you can think of people misusing God's name, committing evil acts in the name of God and saying that they're good?